Enjoy the show? Consider checking out the Lost Sun Society Patreon, which has all the episodes ad-free forever and much more to come in the future. Go to patreon.com/Lost Sun Society or check out the link in the description. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Lost Sun Society. Episode 3, Home in the RSG. Last episode, we talked about the build-up and arrival of the 12 minutes, the apocalyptic bombing that had rolled across the United Kingdom and its great cities. Today, we're going to look at everything that happened immediately afterwards, as the Isles began to settle into what we now know as the aftermath period. The weeks and then years after the bombing are called the aftermath because, it was the aftermath. In the initial days after the explosions, most of the population remained in a state of shock because doing anything else seemed like a surefire way to get yourself killed. But there were a number of ripples, some of which were immediate and some of which were coming much slower, which would force them to have to move and then to adapt. This is where I will have to give fair warning, because although we're beginning to move out of the drought of sources that accompany the 12 minutes themselves, we're now beginning to look at events that have been heavily influenced by the writers who would follow them. The Oxfordians in particular have an extremely rigid view of the early aftermath period, and they are the ones who came to define a lot of the terms that I'm about to use. And you really should keep an open mind about who is deciding on who the heroes and villains are. The first of those ripples that I had mentioned was that the power grid of the United Kingdom had been entirely disabled by the 12 minutes. More than one of the central power stations had been directly hit, and that was to say nothing of the countless power lines or renewable energy generators that had been bowled over by the shockwaves of the blast. If that alone had not been enough to deal a crippling blow to the system, it was also accompanied by waves of electromagnetic pulses, which, without having to explain too much, meant that everything went dark simultaneously. The entire system had been designed with some elasticity in mind, but ultimately everything just snapped. This was the end for a unified system of power generation in the Isles, at least for now. This had far-reaching ramifications, of course, but it meant that many of the hospitals that were now about to deal with an enormous wave of casualties or fatalities had been reduced to backup power, if they even had that, and it would almost certainly not last long. Even after the 12 minutes had passed, the overwhelming chaos of the situation was compounded by the fact that no one person knew what anyone else was doing. In the last episode, we had talked a little bit about the ceaseless tide of information that the average citizen of the time was confronted with at all hours of the day, but now it had suddenly and absolutely been replaced with nothing. If you had not seen the 12 minutes for yourself, the only thing you would have known was that everything had gone dark, and that the only people who you knew were safe were the people right next to you. It had also left many of the local administrators unable to communicate with anyone about anything. They quickly realised that there was no central guidance coming and that they were effectively on their own. They had to sort it out. No one else was coming. Alongside the fact that everyone was in the dark, unable to talk to one another, was that they now had to contend with rapidly declining sources of food. When we think of pre-war society, we have to remember that most of the inhabitants of the United Kingdom had actually been quite far removed from the production of their food, and the average household would only really have enough stored in their house at any one time to last them a couple of weeks, and that was if they were really lucky. When we think of the demand for instant access, and I mentioned this back in episode 1, we tend to only think of it in relation to the luxuries. But it really did affect everything. Food that was local was thus seen as a luxury, not a necessity, because you always had access to food. It was literally less than 5 minutes away. So much of the food that everyone ate from one day to the next was not from their immediate area, but distributed from across the Isles or even from across the globe, carried through the massive networks of international trade. And guess what? The networks had just up and vanished overnight. So once the food in front of you was gone, where were you going to get more? For many survivors, it was a miracle that there were forms of long-lasting canned or dried foods that could last for months on end without being spoiled. But the issue of how they were going to eat was going to be one of the more enduring struggles of the aftermath. Alongside a lack of access to food was the problem that for many of the survivors, the basic currency of the day, the British pound, had just collapsed overnight, if they could even access it. You see, the collapse of the power grid meant that all digital online services were gone. They were permanently offline. And in those days, it was completely normal for most people to have very little in the way of physical money on them at any one time. It was all stored elsewhere. They couldn't access any of this, so they did not have any money. Some people refer to this as the Great Equalizer, because although there had existed a great deal of inequality during the pre-war period, suddenly the amount of people who had access to vast amounts of cash on their person was limited. Very limited. Whether you were a stockholder or a shop assistant, you probably had close to the same amount of cash on your person once the 12 minutes started. So when people needed food, or water, or any of the other necessities that began to become quite rare as the world around them collapsed, there was no one unified system of exchange that was reliable. The lucky few that still had physical cash on them had some advantage, but it was no longer the sole universal means of exchange. Now, these are just some of the ripples that were happening at this time. Similar shocks were also felt in the distribution of water, which dried up within days of the attacks. There was a ripple regarding transportation, because all of the great cities had acted as hubs that the transportation networks had gone through, and that was now decidedly not an option. And that wasn't even considering fuel, which, as the story continues, will become an increasing rarity for anyone to have their hands on. But we'll finish with the ripple that had made staying in one place so appealing for so long: radioactive fallout. Each of the missiles and their payloads had caused an immense amount of irradiated material to be swept up into the air, and it was going to be falling to the Earth for years to come. This wasn't just from the detonations within the Isles either. All of the countries that had been hit the world over would have had dust and dirt tossed into the air and borne upon the wind. Suddenly, the question of moving outside of your home became one of deadly risk. An hour of travel had once sounded quaint, but now sounded quite dangerous. It had the very real effect of making the world seem so much smaller. How far were you willing to go? And was that journey worth risking radiation poisoning? All of these ripples together, many of them happening at the same time, are called the system's collapse. Pre-war society had had a number of incredibly complex and interlocking systems whose existence was dependent entirely on other similarly complex systems. With the 12 minutes, the failures of one of these systems would then lead to the collapse of another, which then causes more failures of other systems in a knock-on effect. One after the other, all of these systems fall apart. As all of the system failures cascade into one another, they have the effect of isolating the people who interacted with them. The entire pre-war system was built on vast amounts of people who interacted with very specific systems in very specialized ways, and these systems just did not exist anymore. You looked at the world around you and realized it was going to require skills that were so different to the skills you had been prepared to use for your entire life. The system's collapse is one of the great events of the aftermath period that is functionally invisible, and from a distance it looks like a number of unconnected events. But it is casting a great shadow over everything that is happening, and it would come to realign how the survivors viewed themselves, the people around them, and how they thought that society would function. I won't dive too much into the gritty details here, because I can assure you there are a number of other sources which can dive into it much better than I can. But it is safe to say that the initial hours, days, and then weeks after the 12 minutes were nothing short of brutal. The first wave of deaths were from the bombs themselves, obviously, but after that, there was a constant nosedive in the population for any number of reasons. People starved, they died of infections, or they were just plain killed while fighting over scarce resources. The first winter of 2043 and the resulting false spring and summer of 2044 is one of the darkest periods in human history. It's difficult to dress them up as anything more than they were, and it is really important to remember that every single one of the coming figures had lived through this event, and there wasn't a single person who was not profoundly affected by this. It is also difficult for me to really dive into the individual events of this period without suffocating you with a list of tragedies, all of which were happening at the same time. Everyone, and I mean everyone, would be able to name people who they lost, people who died with them or near them. They would have seen some really horrific things, and they would have had to have found ways to cope with them. But I shall follow the advice of Harley DeWitt, who is one of my favourite of the post-war utopianists, when he says, "The story is not how we died. The story is how we lived." So, who lived? How did they live? What are we now looking at? If you were forced to make a map of the Isles at the midpoint of 2044, what would you put on that map? It is time for me to paint the picture of what life looked like in the early aftermath period. In the future, I might return to talk about some of the recognisable events from the winter of 2043, but anything relevant that happened in that time will be explained as it comes up. Painting this picture starts with the question of what even exists at this point, and then moves on to how everyone was organised. It is a fairly complex picture, but stick with me, I do promise it is worth it. As was discussed last episode, there had been plans for what the government of the United Kingdom should have done in the event of a nuclear exchange. They had just been left wildly unprepared to actually implement them. And, like an unintentional, suicidal Pied Piper, Prime Minister Peter Newfield had managed to lead quite a sizable chunk of all the actors of central government into the heart of London with his plan to reshuffle the cabinet. And this had just been in time for them all to get vaporised by the 12 minutes. It is slightly ironic that this might have been Peter Newfield's greatest contribution to the world of the aftermath, because it meant that most, although not all, of the architects behind the rotten system had just vanished off the face of the earth. During the months of July and August of 2043, the political actors who had survived, the regional and local politicians, had waited for any word to come from His Majesty's government, and nothing had come. Whilst they waited, there had still been things for them to do. There were still material actions they could take to organise and aid survivors, as well as lay the groundwork for any eventual return to what they considered an ordinary existence. Chief amongst the actions that they could take, influenced perhaps by a sense of self-preservation, were locating themselves and anything that could be moved towards the regional headquarters, where they would be able to access emergency supplies, coordinate responses with local authorities, and generally have somewhere that wasn't completely irradiated to live. The regional headquarters had been assembled by Hunswell Capital. Do you remember them from the previous episode? And there had been very low expectations regarding their functionalities. These were, after all, just another stinking contract in the host of parasitic assignments that had come out of the rotten system. As it turned out, however, the engineer in charge of the construction had been one of the few people who had been thoroughly energised with the project, and those who turned up at the headquarters after the 12 minutes were shocked to find that not only were the much put-off bunkers finished, but that they actually worked. These headquarters had been functionally ready the entire time. It was just that none of the people who would need them had ever been given the chance to rehearse their role in using them. Each of these regional headquarters, naturally, had authority over the regions around them, and with nothing else to act upon, the regional headquarters began to act as if they were the central government. This was not some cynical play by cold-hearted bureaucrats intent on seizing power, but rather a very realistic view of the situation by men and women who thought that this sense of authority was the only thing standing between them and further pointless deaths. As we will see, this only becomes a problem when two separate regions begin to both claim authority over the other. And then it only becomes a really big problem when they begin to disagree. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At this point, if you were to imagine yourself looking at a map of the United Kingdom, you would have to force yourself to stop seeing it as a single entity on the map, and instead start seeing it as a jigsaw of regions with ill-defined boundaries and overlapping authorities. Each of these regions was a web of control that started at the regional headquarters and fanned out into local communities, including towns and villages and cities. Officially, these headquarters were known as regional seats of government, but they were almost instantly referred to by a more colloquial name, the RSGs. Each of the RSGs, which had been deprived of access to a nationwide communication network, was now acting independently of their neighbours, and each of them had their own ideas on how to operate within the landscape of the post-war environment. The most common interpretation of the RSGs are to paint them as bastions of tyranny, piloted by cruel and callous would-be kings. But like I said last episode, most of the councillors or MPs who had survived and were now at the helm had never actually gone through any of the nuclear readiness tests and were pretty much just swatting down issues as they arose. There were 19 RSGs by the summer of 2044, and that is far too many for me to go into detail individually, but I will come to describe them as they become relevant. For now, just know that the regions were vague rather than specific. You had a southwest region, a southeast region, a Midlands region, a northwest region, and so on and so forth. With the image of the RSGs in your mind, a patchwork quilt of authorities laid out across the now scarred landscape of the United Kingdom, we can move on to the people who lived in and around them. The 12 minutes and the following systems collapse had begun a complete and chaotic reorganisation of the citizens of the United Kingdom. One that was quite often random and unforgiving, and one that so often came down to where you had been at the time of the 12 minutes. This reorganisation had started on the very first day of the post-war period, but had begun to really crystallise once the RSGs had begun to congregate and then assert their authority around the false spring of 2044. Where you had ended up within the system of the RSGs was dependent on who you knew, what skills you had, and whether you could bribe your way in. But what makes the following events so interesting, and do bear this in mind as I lay it out, was that none of it had any legal backing. These were all fairly informal systems of control that had arisen out of a sense of necessity, and which managed to spring into existence almost exclusively because the normal rule of law had been utterly suspended. Starting at the very top of this pile, and then working our way down, we begin with the regional commissioners, who would eventually drop the regional and just become known as the commissioners. These are the men and women who asserted themselves as the sole authority within the RSGs, either through natural charisma, pre-war reputation, or less than legitimate means. They had a background in politics in most cases, or were sometimes civil servants who had just been elevated to the role through the lack of opposition, and they were responsible for the administration and organisation of their respective RSG. The commissioners were the ultimate authority of their time, and especially in the first years after the 12 minutes, could act with broad impunity when it came to the administration of the RSGs and the communities around them. Anything that they deemed necessary for the survival of their community was allowed, and they would exercise this authority on numerous occasions. The only guardrails that really existed was that their rule required the consent of the men most immediately below them, and there would come to be more than one occasion in which commissioners overstepped this boundary and very quickly discovered the limits of their own authority. The term commissioner would also broadly come to refer to the little web of family members or trusted confidants who worked around them, and who really should not have wielded any power at all in a better system. Despite this, their personal connection to the Commissioner would all but guarantee a place of priority when it came to the distribution of beds, food, water, and any of the little luxuries that help people cling to their sanity in these months. And before we move on, it is really, really important to remember that even though a number of commissioners were former members of parliament or local councillors, nobody, and I mean nobody, ever really voted for them to become, well, the arbiters of this entire system. So we take one step down the pile to find the people who worked directly for the commissioners, and these were the authorities. This was anyone who had an official assigned role within the system of the RSG, and would likely mean that they lived inside the bunker or immediately outside it in one of the local communities as a representative of the RSG. They provided a line of continuity from the pre-war world into the post-war one, as they had all at one point been employed by the government in some capacity. In the fragile environment after the 12 minutes, they had assumed authority because who else could? Life as a member of the authorities was broadly pretty good when it came to the early aftermath period. The mere fact that you were allowed to work within the RSG was an incredible incentive, as the bunkers were the closest and most reliable thing resembling a modern existence. You were guaranteed a room for yourself, and typically up to 2 other members of your family. You had a fairly stable source of food, you had access to clean water, and you had a job that was almost certainly stable as long as the RSG itself survived. Whilst each RSG approached the question of legality differently, and even the question of whether you were getting paid was dubious, you had a fair amount of leeway that meant as long as you could do your job, there wouldn't be much of a threat of getting tossed to the street. But within the authorities, we see a distinct split into 2 branches. The first branch were the civilian authorities, which represented all those pre-war bureaucrats, civil servants, or communication experts that held a niche within the system. The classic literary trope of the men in the bunkers, and God knows I've seen that far too much, usually refers to these people. They were responsible for a vast sea of logistical and organisational nightmares which they were constantly juggling to try and ensure that the RSG didn't just sink. Whenever the commissioner had an idea, it was up to the civilian authorities to see it implemented. And given that strand of continuity with the pre-war world that they represented, many of the civilian authorities believed themselves to be the continuation of the British government and completely justified in their actions as a result. We'll come back to how true that is later. The second branch within the authorities were the military authorities, which is actually a rather broad term given that it covered both soldier and police, although at this point distinctions between these roles had really started to blur. These were the men and women who were giving the orders to their inferiors and were responsible for the security of the RSGs and the local communities that were attached to them. The military authorities tended to be a smaller group than their civilian counterparts, but they saw themselves as the glue that held the damn business together. After all, it was their men on the breadlines, it was their men who kept the prisons maintained, and it was them who kept the civilian authorities and commissioners from getting their door busted down by every roving have-nothing who wanted something to eat. Needless to say, the civilian authorities never quite agreed with this point of view. We then begin to move outside of the bunkers themselves, but we are still moving within the spheres of the RSGs. Everyone in the following roles still considered themselves a part of these regional authorities because they were the bedrock of life in the early aftermath. But where the previous groups had only really represented a very small amount of the population, we're now moving into larger and larger groups. There were, of course, the soldiers, which at this point referred to anyone that held a gun and was directed by the authority of the RSG. The soldiers were, pretty simply, the muscle, the hands and fists of the RSG. They would cover much of the menial day-to-day security work, like the aforementioned handling of the breadlines, maintaining of prisons, keeping the doors from getting busted down by unwashed hordes. Except, Unlike the military authorities, the soldiers were only afforded a marginally more comfortable existence than some of the other groups we're about to talk about. They got first picking of the bread, sure, but they were still eating the same bread. To be honest, it was a fairly thankless task, and it involved a lot of painful, menial work, often conducted outside, where you were at the highest risk of inhaling a lungful of radioactive dust. Soldiers would initially be recruited from the pre-war military and reserves, naturally, but as their numbers continually suffered, they would pull in any number of men from the local police forces, the unorganised militia, and basically anyone who was halfway trained in the arts of discipline and firing of guns. The soldiers who hailed from the military tradition would always look down upon those who were brought into the organisation, and so this is yet another group where we see internal tensions that might come up later. After the soldiers, we have the rabbles of civilians who flocked to the RSGs. Everyone mentioned up until this point has been working with the bunkers from pretty much as soon as they were operational, but we're now looking at the vast majority of people who only learned of the existence of the RSGs after the fact. These rabbles are going to be interchangeably referred to by a number of names, as they were categorized in different fashions between the various RSGs. They would be citizens in one region, and they would be dependents in others. But the easiest way to classify them is based on skill set, because this came to be the common currency of the early aftermath period. The most enviable position amongst the civilians were the experts, upon which the functioning of the RSG did rely. Experts did not specifically refer to anyone who had worked in academia or was university educated, but rather anyone who held a skill that was valuable after the system's collapse. Experts had those rare specialized skills that were still relevant to the maintaining of the RSGs and everyone within them. You simply could not have a functioning society if you did not have some of these people. Here is where you might find the doctors, or engineers, or even agriculturalists. Experts held little in the way of political power, at least for now, but their skills were recognized and rewarded. Nobody, not the commissioners, not the authorities, and not the soldiers, wanted the only guy who knew how to maintain the RSG circulation system to suddenly up and die, so you would be plied with all the little luxuries that might normally be reserved for a higher ranking authority. Now, you were still required to work, and work pretty damn hard, but you could at least do so with a full belly, a roof over your head, and a hot shower waiting for you at the end of the day. There were degrees to experts as well, and your position would be affected accordingly. After all, some roles were higher in demand than others, so there was also the petty experts, who existed in a kind of competition with one another and received less privileges than the capital E experts. But even if you were a petty expert, you were still pretty much guaranteed work, and if the role started emptying out, you might become one of those rare necessities. Around the experts were also a smattering of apprentices, or would-be experts, who would have ascended from the lower categories to help prevent any bottlenecks forming where an expert died and left no replacement. Opposite the experts was where the vast majority of us would have sat if we had been alive at the time, as the so-called unskilled. So much of the population no longer had skills that were really needed, and which only existed for jobs that had vanished with the systems collapsed. But these people obviously couldn't just be left to starve. So, if you didn't have a skill that was needed or valuable or coveted, you could still just offer to work for any job that was left, if there were any. Jobs for the unskilled were assigned daily and would either be organised by lotteries or just on a first-come, first-served basis. This meant that as unskilled, you had no guarantee of work, and a continual lack of work would often spell very hard times for yourself and your family. You were afforded a daily ration, but housing, clothing, some of the basic tools for survival were always in short supply. Sometimes you could attach to an expert or an authority, which would land you good and consistent work, but the moment that expert was replaced or you made a mistake, you were just as likely to be back outside, and it did not make the work itself any easier. The vast majority of the unskilled worked in manual labour of any kind, and a lot of it was very hard work. The majority of the work was fairly thankless agricultural work, which was back-breaking labour in freezing conditions that involved toiling through the vast amounts of failed produce in hope of finding the few surviving samples. Even then, you still did have it better than some others. So, even in conditions that were pretty terrible, you'd still try and hang on with everything that you had. At this point, I have to talk about the landed, which is one of those really strange categorizations that I just have to mention because they are such an oddity. This group didn't have the specialization of the experts, nor did they bother to offer up manual labor like the unskilled. No, the landed basically only existed because of pre-war obligation, and they really didn't deserve much of anything. To explain why on earth they existed, as the RSGs expanded into the local communities around them, they would often acquire or appropriate the local properties for the sake of the community. Now, many of the owners of these properties were just gone, but in some cases you had situations where the owners were still alive, but the RSG really needed the property. Rather than just taking the property by force or executing the owners on the street, which was generally seen as bad taste, they would instead appropriate the properties and allow the owner or owners to oversee its use, working to either help the development of the shelter or just generally overseeing the people who would be moved there. Being landed was usually a temporary position at best, but some of these people were really, really good at just not shutting up about the obligation that the RSG had towards them, and they managed to continue existing without really ever contributing anything. They existed in a state of limbo, heavily reliant on their relationship with the authorities or the commissioner, and then trying to establish themselves as pillars of the local communities. That's the last of the group we call the citizens, and at this point we're not going to move down the list, but rather to the side, because we now begin to look at the groups who existed parallel to the influence of the RSGs. Prior to the war, there had been small pockets of society that had already been convinced of the coming war and had dedicated an immense amount of time and resources to being prepared for it. Prior to the war, they had given, or taken, the name of preppers. In time, they will earn the moniker hoarders instead, and that might give you an idea of how they will be perceived. Preppers did not necessarily always mean the people who actually built the shelter. Some of those who had devoted their lives to creating these little paradises outside of society hadn't actually ever gotten to use them, and it just refers to anyone who was living in them by the time that the RSGs had gotten organised. But having access to one of these shelters meant that you lived and worked beyond any of the rigours of the RSG, and ultimately were not beholden to them. It did not mean that you did not work, as will quickly become a stereotype. And in many instances, it meant that you actually worked more than some of your counterparts in the bunkers. How you reacted to the world around you would define whether you as a prepper were referred to as an open door or closed door shelter, and no prizes for guessing what these meant. You would either find ways to accommodate people as best you could, or you would shut everyone apart from your closest circle out and pretend that the outside world didn't exist. These preppers existed in a continual state of tension with the RSGs, because the RSGs rightly believed they acted with the authority of the pre-war government. But most of the preppers believed that, really, they were just trying to wait out the worst of the coming nuclear winters, and they were just okay. Please and thank you. There were also the small pockets of communities that had survived entirely well without the influence of the RSGs, and who pretty broadly rejected their authority when they arrived. You might remember from the first episode, where I mentioned that the radical movement had found a way to survive through aligning themselves into the charities and support networks that the Rotten system heavily relied on. Well, when the apocalypse arrived, these groups were some of the best situated to find ways to adapt and survive. Many of the groups would then acquiesce to the demands of the RSGs and integrate, but there were a number of them who outright refused. They had most of what they needed, and bowing to the RSGs would only see everything that they had worked for stripped away. It had been a long winter for many of them, and they were rightly traumatized by the events. For the time being, the RSGs simply didn't have the resources to attempt to bring these groups to heel. So, they existed in a state of limbo. These communities had acted as shelters for many of the refugees of the great cities in the earliest days of the aftermath, or they had been built entirely from those refugees in the great cities. And these groups identified each other with a simple white banner. The white banner was chosen for how easy it was to create. You could just use a bedsheet after all, and how easy it was to spot in the dark, as there were plenty of sunless days during the winter of 2043. For this reason, these communities would come to be known as the White Banners. Life in a White Banner community was generally more evenly distributed than that of an RSG, but at the same time, they generally had a much harder time, much like the Preppers did. The RSGs had had many of the basic systems for their survival built into their infrastructure, but the White Banners were working with nothing and had to rebuild all of it from the ground up. They had a hard life, but they held on to it dearly, and they were prepared to fight for it. Finally, beneath everyone else, sitting at the bottom of the pile, not parallel to the RSGs and not within them, are the have-nothings, named because, well, they had nothing. Practically, this refers to the large amount of the population who had been forced out of their homes and onto the road. They were typically refugees from one of the great cities, but those who had struggled to settle into the class of unskilled around the RSGs, or into the White Banners, for a number of reasons. They were an eclectic bunch because there was nothing that really unified them. No real reasons why they had to end up as have-nothings compared to the people around them. Some of them had once been some of the richest people of the Isles, and now they had nothing to offer the RSGs. They might have also been the poor or homeless, or just those who had the misfortune of being far from home when the 12 minutes began and the system's collapse followed. Regardless of how they got there, they survived on an existence of subsistence, scraping out a living on the periphery of the RSGs or one of the open-door shelters. Have-nothings were basically found everywhere that could sustain life, but not a luxurious life. It shouldn't be surprising that they will get categorized as stupid, dirty, and dangerous, when in fact they were so often tough, innovative, and welcoming. Okay, let's pause for a second because I've just thrown a bunch of names at you and might not all feel like it fits together. So, let's summarize everything that I've told you so far. You had the regional seats of government, which were located in the bunkers built by Hunswell Capital and which are known as RSGs. At the very top, you have the regional commissioners, who basically try and organise everyone else, and then beneath the commissioners, you have the authorities, working under their instruction. The authorities are split between the civilian authorities, who see themselves as above the soldiers and as the only thing keeping this system from resembling a military dictatorship, and the military authorities, who see themselves as the only thing keeping anarchy at bay, and who think the bureaucrats are fine for now, but they better start making things much more pleasant soon. Sitting outside the bunkers, but really wishing they were inside it, you have the soldiers, who are given guns and bread and told to keep everyone else in line. Working in and around the RSGs, you have the expert citizens who have skills so necessary at this point that they are afforded various luxuries. You have petty experts who are slightly less valuable, and then you have the landed citizens who don't really have anything to offer but the fact that they are geographically there. Finally, you have the great masses of the unskilled citizens who don't really have any specific skills but are still given a daily ration and a chance to work. Then, outside of the whole circus of the RSGs, you have the preppers, or the hoarders, who basically think that they're doing just fine, and the RSGs should leave them alone for a while. You also have the White Banners, who somehow waded through the early months of the apocalypse without any of the RSGs, and then, finally, getting kicked around by everyone else are the have-nothings, who are just scrambling to survive. This whole mess, which again had no legal backing, was the society that had so far survived the bombs. These were the people who had gone through the bitter nights of 2043 and the false hope of 2044. There will be further details to come if you can believe it, but we'll just have to wait for the future. Because at the tail end of the false summer in 2044, the commissioners at the heart of the RSGs would receive a message that they hadn't thought it was possible to receive because all the communication networks were dead. It was from a woman named Ilsa Ludek, and it said that the time had come to make things better. Next episode, we will head into the bunkers and meet the woman who was determined to rebuild everything. Thanks Thanks for listening. If you like the show, do go support us on Patreon. It's the best and most direct way to ensure that the show can keep going, and you get access to all the episodes without any of the annoying ads. All the tiers get access to the same content, so you can pay as much or as little as you want. Go to patreon.com/LostSunSociety, all one word, or check out the link in the description. I'll see you next episode.